Now that we've studied protests around the world and across centuries, you may have a better understanding of how protests begin from society's discontents and then push their way into the public consciousness. We've seen successful protests with long-lasting impacts for humans all around the world. We've seen unsuccessful protests that sparked into life with intensity but did not have sustainable momentum or support. We've seen governments and corporations forced to the bargaining table because of protests, but we've also seen governments harshly crush protests using military force. The underlying themes behind each of these protests is eerily similar across societies, centuries, and governments. It usually starts with oppression by a powerful government or corporation. There is discrimination or unfair treatment of marginalized individuals. There is disagreement with the government's policies, sometimes within the country or other times with foreign countries. When people feel that injustice, they begin to seek a way to change the system and organize together as one voice. Many of the most powerful protests had singular icons, like Martin Luther King Jr. But these icons would not have had any impact on the world if ordinary people were not willing to stand with them and make their collective voices heard. Think about the issues that you are passionate about and would like to see changed in the world. What is your role in affecting change on these issues? What role does protest play, if any, in changing these issues? In America, we are lucky enough to live in a country with the freedom of speech and freedom of the press. We are allowed to voice our discontent with the government and are protected by the Bill of Rights for doing so. Many people around the world are not so lucky. Imagine that you live as part of a group of oppressed citizens of a country. Maybe your rights have been trampled on, or maybe you are being unfairly persecuted. What are your options of pushing back against the system? How can you express your discontent in a way that elicits public support, but also gets your message across to the authorities that are in charge? Is violence an answer? What about a consumer boycott or a labor strike? These are all types of protests that must be carefully considered by groups of people all across the world. Protest is a universal language that rises up from people who have few options and whose voices are not being heard. Elie Wiesel is quoted as saying, "There may be times when we are powerless to prevent injustice, but there must never be a time when we fail to protest." It is our duty as conscious citizens of our communities and countries to speak out against injustices and attempt to change the system for the better. We must allow for protest as a result of a functioning democracy. This doesn't mean that all protests are justified, but it does mean we have to allow for differing opinions across the spectrum of humanity. Protests have changed every aspect of the world we live in, and they will continue to spark change in the centuries to come.